key aspects of instrument flying. Well, a little bit about me. Again, I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen this slide, but just for those of you guys who don't know, I'm a CFII here at Princeton Flying School since August 2022. I took my first intro flight here at 3-9 November, and I moved on. I continued my training there, and on the side, again, I'm an IT specialist, and I do audio engineering. I do a lot of consulting around the tri-state area in my free time, and then I get my hands into different projects and things and such. And I did that last week. I do a lot of things with Raspberry Pis when it relates to flying, and a little bit of engineering projects on the side. So, I try to dabble in everything. Excellent. All right. And going back to a video that we had seen last time, looking at how quickly you can develop into instrument or IMC conditions, right? I was telling people before, it can happen as little as 5 minutes, right? Or even shorter span. You can take a look. I started it, this time it starts at the right position. But this gentleman, he narrates this video, and from the point of when he's in clear IMC, continues through, and he has this get there-itis kind of mentality. And over the course of just a few moments, just a few minutes, you can see how it develops into a very thick, low fog layer. And I think that shows you just how quickly it can develop and how quickly that your instrument skills may need to come into place. Now, I have some little bit of different statistics this time, or a different kind of a view of instrument flying, or what it means to us as pilots, for the next slide here. All right, the instrument skills require constant practice to keep safe, right? And this goes out to those pilots who already have their instrument license or their instrument rating, and feel satisfied with where they're at. I challenge you guys to continually practice, to continually learn. And the fact that you're in this webinar tonight, I think that's a testament, right? Instrument pilots must be 2 steps ahead. I think when you're going from a private to an instrument level, right? You're developing your muscle memory, your flying skills, your aptitude, your knowledge, and also your planning skills in staying 2 steps ahead of the aircraft, not only from the ground, but in the air, right? So I think going to the testament that instrument pilots must be 2 steps ahead of their aircraft leads to the statistics that instrument pilots are generally safer, right? And I urge those of you who are in this webinar tonight, who are thinking about pursuing additional training, to definitely go for your instrument rating. According to the FAA, 30% of aviation accidents are associated to weather-related incidents. Like we said before, this is one of the leading causes of aviation accidents. So I think getting your instrument rating is in everyone's benefit. All right. So again, going through the benefits, flying when and where you want, right? You don't have to worry about the weather and the changing conditions. Become a more competent aviator. Become a meteorology pro, right? We're not going to dig into too much of weather analysis tonight, but there'll be a separate webinar on that. But the whole idea is that because you're an instrument-rated pilot, you have the abilities to analyze the weather a little bit more in depth, improve your pre-flight planning, and become a safer pilot. All right. So what we discussed last time, we covered regulations, navigation publications. So last time you guys learned about the different publications that are available to you as instrument pilots, and then some of the navigational systems and aids, right? Like the VOR systems, the NDB systems, the GPS systems, and the amount of satellites that are up in the air, and understanding how that relates to inside the aircraft, right? We dug in depth in taking a look at the avionics structure and how it relates to navigating the instrument system. So if you guys haven't seen that webinar or those slides, it is published on the website. But this is just a small recap of what we did. But tonight we're going to be covering the ATC system and clearances, your responsibilities working in the IFR or the instrument or the flying system, approaches, briefing approach plates. And then we're going to do a little flight planning demo in ForeFlight, where I show you guys how I set up a flight in ForeFlight for flying in these weather conditions. All right, so continuing ATC systems and clearances. All right, let's go ahead and slide that. ATC systems and clearances. Air traffic clearance. So I'm sure a lot of you guys have watched those videos online of pilots who are flying, and they have to pick up an IFR clearance, and you hear the air traffic controller spit back a whole set of lines, array of lines, and it's very confusing. There's a lot of words coming out of pilot, and it's incredible how they're able to read it back. But for those of you guys who don't know, in order to fly in the air traffic control system, you need a clearance, right? And that clearance follows a specific line order. In this image, I have it depicted. For flight has a nice scratch pad that gives you craft clearance, right? So CRAFT, and that's what we use as an acronym to help us consolidate that information that ATC gives us. First would be the clearance limit, right? Where you are cleared to, your route, and then your altitude, then your frequency, then your transponder. Your clearance limit, where you are cleared to, right? So typically you're going to be cleared to an airport, right? If you're flying from point A to point B, you write that airport in there. And typically I like to write the airport that I'm going to beforehand, just because I can anticipate that. However, it's a common misconception that you're going to be cleared to a specific airport all the time. You might be cleared to just a specific fix. Let's say there's a lot going on during a route of flight. ATC just might clear you to a specific fix, and you may need to receive further clearance in order to go further on. Your route, right? So you have filed a route, and it's also good to be aware of the route that you're flying, right? And then ATC may have amendments to that route, so you can be writing that out as they spell it out to you. Altitudes along your route of flight. So typically you have a altitude that you're going to stop at before you reach your cruising altitude, and air traffic controller will give you about 10 minutes or so, or a space of 10 minutes to let you know when you can proceed on to climbing to your cruising altitude. Around the tri-state area, I've seen them say 2,000, then 10 minutes after, expect the cruising altitude or the climb altitude. But it can vary depending on the area that you're at or depending on their load. Of course, the departure frequency and then the transponder frequency that you have there when you're receiving your IFR clearance. So as air traffic control spells all the information out to you, you're going to be able to consolidate. Our duty is to read it back, clarify any confusion, and read back the craft in the order that it was given to you. And this is good because it validates that you understand and you know each information. If there's any confusion, always ask. Continuing through, obtaining it, right? At a towered airport, it's quite easy. Towered airports, you can talk to the tower frequency, you can talk to the ground frequency and request it. More likely than not, right, or more often than not, you're going to be using the clearance delivery if it's available. So if clearance delivery is available at the airport that you're at, if it's a towered field, you contact them to get your clearance. But sometimes, depending on workload, depending on the kind of environment, tower or ground will be able to give you your clearance as well. Now, it gets a little bit tricky when you're looking at non-towered airports. So Princeton is a non-towered airport. When you are doing an IFR flight plan, you can't really contact a lot of frequencies from the ground. So how do you do it? From the ground, you can call ATC on their landline. ForeFlight has that in the detail section of every airport, the closest clearance facility that you can call. Just their 1-800 line or whatever number that's listed there, you can reach that. And that's the benefit of the headsets with the Bluetooth, because in the aircraft, you can use your Bluetooth to call and get that clearance. Now, of course, you have other methods like the FSS, right? So the flight service station, you can contact that 1-800-WX brief, right? You can contact them, get a clearance from the ground as well. And then ground communication outlets. I've seen this around, but ground communication outlets, from what I understand, is they are, you can communicate to a frequency at an airport, and that is going to connect you to a landline to a facility that will be able to offer you clearance. So you can communicate through the landline, through that outlet that will then get it to whatever clearance facility covers that area. Now, if you're airborne, you can also get a clearance, right? You can get a pop-up clearance, so whatever it may be, right? So if you're flying VFR, you find yourself going into those instrument conditions, or if you just want to pick up your general clearance. I know a lot of people do this because, which we're about to go into, there's some delays on the ground. If there's any delays on departing, some people prefer to depart the airport off of VFR and then pick up their IFR clearance in the sky rather than just waiting on the ground for release, which we'll go into. But you can contact ATC, Unicom to ATC. There are radio communication outlets that you can communicate with a FSS. So kind of the same principle, using your frequency to use the communication outlet, which then leads it to a flight service station off of a landline. And then, of course, when you do receive this clearance or at the hold short line and you request what we call release to depart a non-tower field, you will have a clearance avoid time, right? A time at which you have an envelope to depart that airport. And that's very, very important because the way that the air traffic control system works is that everything is very sequential, right? If you take off at the wrong time, your flight path could coincide with someone else's, right? So there's a very specific time. It's like a big, beautiful dance in the sky that everybody's very coordinated on. Continuing through your pilot responsibilities, flight plan and IFR clearance, we have the FAR for that. Acknowledging receipt of this clearance, clarifying if necessary, or requesting clearance if necessary, reading back all hold short instructions, promptly complying with ATC clearances, seeing a void, and of course, you have the final authority. So if there's anything or any reason why you can't do any of these options, right, you are the pilot in command. Now, as far as the controller responsibilities, I know this is a different kind of point of view, but it's important to know what the controller's responsibilities are so that you can operate safely as well. Controller's responsibilities is issue appropriate clearances, right? Assign altitudes above minimum IFR altitude. So any altitude that you know that you're assigned, you can automatically assume that you are safe and well clear. And then ensure pilot acknowledgement and readback of all clearances. So you should never feel like you're in a situation where you don't feel validated, right? So if you received a clearance or received an acknowledgement, you need to repeat it back so that ATC can validate it, and then include specific departure, include and specify the specific departure procedures, which we'll go into. Now, the way that I like to set up when I'm departing out of an airport, the comm nav structure, right? So this is super important. Again, we're staying 2 steps ahead of the aircraft. So I think this is an excellent visual. When you're looking at a comm setup, right? In comm 1, typically I have my departure frequencies. And then I'll have my tower active on that comm 1 departure frequency in the standby, because I know as soon as I take off, I'm switching over to departure as per the clearance. Then in nav 1, right, our first station frequency, of course, and then the approach frequency in case of an emergency return in nav 2. If you have a PFD set up, right, you want to make sure that your heading bug is on your departure heading, right, and you want to bug that initial altitude so there's no space to forget. Enter and verify your GPS route. I always stress this. Always, whenever you put in a GPS route or a route, make sure that you validate it with a secondary source like ForeFlight, and then you zoom out on the Garmin 430 to make sure that flight plan looks exactly like you specify. Running through the flight plan, making sure all your fixes, the distances, nothing's absurd. You don't want to see a line going out to California or something that's something weird. Maybe you misspelled something, so make sure that you check that. Of course, you want to put in that assigned code on the ground, leaving it on standby until you're ready for takeoff, and then switching it into the altitude mode. All right, so the next is your responsibilities, right? So understanding your responsibilities a little bit more in depth as it relates to a pilot. It's important that we have the departure procedures on board, right? Any departure or briefing those departure procedures that we need. Types of departures. You have obstacle departure procedures. If you're trying to clear an obstacle, right? You also have standard instrument departure procedures. Standard instrument departures, right? Because a lot of people don't know, a lot of us in general aviation don't really receive these that often, but there is a way that you need to get onto that en route structure of your flight plan. So from the ground to the en route structure, sometimes air traffic control, depending on workload, if they're too busy, they may assign you a departure procedure, which will lead you to the full en route structure of your flight plan. So make sure you're aware of the departure procedures that you could be assigned. Planning for that, right? Understanding your obstacle departure procedures, right? If there's an obstacle on the field, running through and getting either the textual description or the visual depiction. We're going to be taking a look at that in a moment. And then air traffic control responsibility, specifying direction, heading, pilot and concurrence, and then include the departure procedure in the clearance, right? So it should never be a surprise of whether or not you have a departure procedure. And I know recently, on a side note, I saw a video on YouTube where an air traffic controller kind of went in on someone for not being prepared or not understanding the departure procedure. It's very, very important. And air traffic control, sometimes they get stressed, but they're there to help, right? They're there to trust. These people are put into that position to help us. So in that case, if you have any confusion, or if you don't understand a departure procedure, or if you are confused, you can always ask for vectors or assignments to get out, right? That's perfectly fine if you feel like you're overloaded. You may experience some delays, but that's also something that's there for your benefit. All right, next, understanding the en route charts. So the departure procedures carry you onto the en route charts, and it's our responsibility to make sure that we have all the up-to-date en route charts. Like we discussed in the last webinar, I'm going to briefly run through this. We have the low altitude charts. We have the high altitude charts. Our responsibility is to make sure that we have the appropriate chart currency, and we are complying with the published altitudes and requirements. Air traffic control's responsibility is to make sure that we're receiving, again, the appropriate clearances, the altitudes at or above the minimum altitudes that are listed on the chart, right? So you'll know for each of your Victor airways, or these little black lines that they're basically highways in the sky. Along the top of them, you'll have your minimum en route altitude, sometimes your minimum obstacle clearing altitude there as well. But air traffic control is ensuring that you're staying above those altitudes in any of their assignments, ensuring that the pilot acknowledges and has a proper readback, and ensuring traffic separation along those routes, right? Continuing through, once you get to your destination, you're going to have something called a star, right? So I don't know if you guys have ever been passing along the highway and seen these planes kind of in line with lights kind of leading out into the distance. Stars, standard terminal arrival routes, right? They help you transition from the en route structure or your flight plan to the airport. Now, you could be assigned these. Let's say if the air traffic controller, again, is too busy with a workload, you'll be given a star, a terminal arrival route to guide you from your flight plan to the airport. Pilot's responsibilities, airports with a star, flying the star and making sure that you have any procedure that's available for that airport. Keep in mind, they also have the textual description. So you need at least a textual description on board to be able to fly that route. And of course, like with anything, if you don't have it on board for any odd reason, speak up, make sure that it's clear, because it's the worst thing in the world to accept a arrival route or departure and then mess it up or not know exactly what you're doing. Continuing through, selecting these navigation publications, just reiterating what we said before. Make sure you have the necessary current publications, departure and route, arrival, any alternatives, and route charts and route navigation charts, making sure that they are current. Your terminal procedure publications, making sure all of your terminal publications are correct. Chart supplement information, making sure that they're up to date. Of course, ForeFlight handles this for us, but just making sure on the ground that you've downloaded the current charts and information, because that is your due diligence as a pilot. All right, continuing through. Responsibilities continuing on, right? And when you're flying, turning immediately whenever you're receiving vectors. Question, advise ATC if necessary for any of your reporting points or anything that you need to make them aware of. Altitude assignments, making sure that you're keeping the altitudes assigned by ATC. And then if you are doing VFR on top operations, meaning if you want to fly VFR above the clouds, let's say there's a cloud layer above you and you need to file to get through it, you can do VFR on top operations, where you can be given a block of altitude that you can operate from, making sure that you're maintaining or staying within that block of altitude that you were given. Airspeed, maintaining the assigned speed that you file on the route. A lot of people don't know this, but if your speed changes plus or minus 10 knots with your from what you publish, it's incumbent upon you. It's a mandatory reporting that you let them know that your speed or your the speed of your flight is going to be changing. Why? Because again, it's a choreographed dance up there in the skies when you're flying these routes. They have the aircraft timed, their departures timed so that nothing intersects. So if your speed is changing, it could change a lot of dynamics further along your route. Report change 5% or 10 knots, whichever is greater. Then of course, I've listed the FAR there that you can check out for specific aircraft speeds. Continuing through on responsibilities when you're looking at the route structure, making sure that you're keeping the airway center line. I have the form that states you want to be directly on the center line, or as accurate as possible. Adhering to the route flown, complying with ATC clearances, making sure that headings, radar vectors, right? I've listed all the AIM procedures for those. Deviating from clearances for any odd reason, right? Making sure, and for 91.123 lists those circumstances that are acceptable. Acknowledging receipt or clearances and notifying ATC if you are unable to comply. For example, if you are flying along a route of flight and ATC gives you a heading that goes into a huge thunderstorm system that maybe you see that is a detriment to your aircraft or your flying capabilities, you can speak up and let them know that the heading that they have given you is not conducive to a safe flight. Of course, emergencies. In an emergency, you can deviate from any rule to meet the emergency, making sure that you land safely, priority number one. All right. Comm frequencies. I've included
Michael, we have some questions in the chat.
Ooh, yeah, I'm seeing it. I'm seeing the number pop, but let's take a look here. All right. So, is it okay to tell ATC that you are a student instrument pilot? Of course, right? So I know you can always prefix things and say a student pilot and request that, right? 'Cause sometimes they can go slower and that can indicate. I know one of my flight instructors had advised me that in the comments of the filing section of ForeFlight, which we'll go back to check out, you can put in the comments that you are a student pilot, right? They'll be able to see that and adhere to that or help slow down as well. Is there a star for EWR? Yes, more than likely. Yeah. They have plenty of standard terminal arrival routes for each runway at Newark International Airport. And then as far as the usefulness for 39 November, based off of the ones that I've seen, a lot of them are really beneficial for aircraft that are coming from the flight levels. So maybe the turboprops that you see coming into Princeton Airport, they'll be using the terminal arrival routes and that break off into Princeton, but nothing for a lot of general aviation aircraft. But it is good to be aware of them. Let's say that you're flying in a part of the country where the arrival route does kind of meet the specification for your aircraft. I hope that answers a couple of the questions there. And let me know if you need any clarification on those. All right, continuing through communication frequencies. So I've listed a couple communication frequencies that you can experience in the description and the frequency for those, right? Like your Unicom, your air traffic control center, right? So if you're above 8,000 feet or specified, sometimes you might be handed over to center, your approach and departure, your ATIS, right? You have clearance delivery, and a little bit of description of each of these comm frequencies in depth that you can review on the slides. Continuing through. If you do have a communication failure, right? I see this a lot, right? Let's say that you were assigned a frequency from air traffic control that you maybe they're human, right? So they make mistakes. So let's say they gave you the wrong frequency for the wrong quadrant, or maybe you messed up on the frequency and you completely forgot which frequency it was and you switched it over, or you messed up your comm panel and you're not exactly sure which frequency to go back to. take a breather, right? You are a pilot, right? You can solve the situation by critically thinking. And I've been in situations like this. If you take a look at the map or the sectional, you're able to see either contact a tower or a approach controller that you know, or you can reach out to center. They'll maybe ask you to ident, and they'll be able to guide you to the right frequency that you should be on. So there's many avenues that you can take before squawking 7600. I've seen many situations where people just go straight for the 7600, not actually critically thinking about ways that they can reestablish communication. So make sure that you keep that in mind. Sometimes I monitor guard when I'm flying, and every often I'll hear an air traffic controller on guard trying to reach out to an aircraft that may have been in a lost comm situation, right? That's also an avenue. So if you're ever in a lost comm situation, put on guard, right? Because maybe the air traffic controller may be trying to reach you on a different frequency. But of course, if nothing works, or if you're in a very peculiar situation where maybe your communications panel is actually degrading or not working, you can squawk 7600. Continue or deviate. That's something that a lot of people think about, right? You continue on an IFR flight plan. For example, on a VFR, you maintain VFR and land as soon as practical. But on an IFR flight plan, again, like I told you guys, it's a choreographed dance, right, in the sky, where a lot of people are flying specific routes, and you're expected to be in a certain location at a certain time. You're expected, if you're in an IMC condition, right, to continue with your routes and do what's expected. I have this nice little chart here, right? You do either first what was last assigned from ATC. If you were being radar vectored, fly directly to the fix or the route that was specified, and then continue thereafter. Do what was expected in the absence of an assigned route. Fly the route that ATC told you to expect, or whatever was filed, right? So if you don't have any of those, do whatever was filed, continue the trip following what was filed, and then do an approach into an appropriate runway, and then get your radio communication solved once you land. And then we have that kind of FAR there, kind of consolidated. FAR 91.185 goes into exactly what I just said there. So you can reference it on your check ride or exam. All right, continuing through, I wanted to take a look really briefly there at checklist items. So when you are flying a route or trying to stay, again, 2 steps ahead of the aircraft, it's important to have checklist items that you're going through. A lot of people like the FIMS checklist. Make sure that you have a flow that you go over. Whenever you are about to head to an approach point, make sure that you brief the approach plate, which we're going to go through. I'll show you how I brief my approach plates: fixes, frequencies, inbound courses, identify any fixes, marker beacons, make sure you're aware of them and where they're at, minutes, right? Let's say if it's a timed approach, make sure that you're aware of how many minutes it's going to take you to get to your point. Go through your missed plan, and then security, making sure the aircraft is secure, switches, of course, right? So having a flow that goes through is very, very important. And these are acronyms that you may want to remember that will make your life a lot easier. Your 5 T's, right? Turn, time, twist, throttle, talk, right? I know a lot of people just use them in the holds. However, you can do this for any fix you're approaching, right? And for those who don't know, this is a great acronym to use whenever you're approaching a fix or your next fix, staying ahead of the plane. I was doing practice approaches today with a student on the simulator, and I was just letting them know, right? We're approaching the next fix. We're going to turn. You don't have the time for this fix. We'll twist our OBS to, so-and-so heading. We'll adjust the throttle for this next fix. And then is this a reporting point that we have to think about? So running through that checklist and kind of taking out what's not needed, so on and so forth, is very, very beneficial. Running through your pre-landing checklist, dumps. Even if you're in a fixed wing gear aircraft, I suggest running through this, right? Gumps, gas, undercarriage, mixture, props, flaps, seatbelts, right? Making sure whenever we say gas, your mixture's full rich, your undercarriage, if you have a retractable gear aircraft, making sure your gear is down, 3 green, mixture, making sure your apologies, the gas, making sure your fuel selector is selected on the right tank. But of course, again, making sure your mixture is full rich. Your prop, making sure your prop is full rich, or full. Your prop lever is full so that you have the maximum performance on that prop. And then, of course, your flaps in the appropriate position. I like one detent when I'm coming from the final approach fix or the initial approach fix. Keeps the aircraft nice and stabilized. And then, of course, your seatbelt and switches, landing lights, boost pumps, whatever it may be for the aircraft that you're flying. Now, of course, I like to use the airbags checklist. That's my preferred one. About 25 nautical miles from the airport, 30, just running through that. Airbags, ATIS, making sure that we have the current ATIS information, making sure that our instrument approach is loaded as based off of the ATIS information. Radios, making sure when we're briefing that approach trip, making sure that we have all the radios put into COM 1, standby, COM 2, standby, so on and so forth. And then making sure that we brief the approach plate. That's very, very important. I do two briefs. I do a brief on the ground, a nice full brief, so I know what to expect. And then I do a briefing in the air en route, right? So I've already briefed it. So I'm kind of just going down information that I already know, right? Just planning that entire route of flight. Making sure approach mode is activated. A lot of people get this messed up on their check ride. So make sure that approach mode is not only loaded, but activated when you're ready to use it, including the CDI switch, depending on what approach that you're doing, right? Go arounds, making sure your go around plan is briefed. And then, of course, seatbelt and switches. So the same thing, just reiterating gumps. But doing any one of these checklist items or doing a lot of them in combination will make you a safer pilot. And it's leading to you, again, staying 2 steps ahead of the aircraft, the theme for tonight. All right, cool. And we're going to run through briefly through approaches. All right, we're going to get a little bit of background information on some of the approaches that we're going to be looking at tonight. We discussed this in depth in part 1, but I'm going to be just kind of briefly going over a lot of them. Non-precision approach, they provide course deviation, but no glide path deviation. So VFR, TACAN, LNAV, NDB, localizer, or ASR approaches are a couple of them. And then on the converse, of course, you have precision approaches and approaches with vertical guidance, which we'll be taking a look at. And then you have your, typically you'll have a minimum descent altitude with those, right? And that's as suggested. So a descent altitude, that is your minimum that you would hold at and cannot legally go below unless you have any part of the runway visible, the threshold lights, the end identifier lights, the runway lights, the center line lights, the PAPI lights, or the approach lighting system, any of those. And make sure you're familiar with the requirements in 91.175 lists it out, all of the required items that you're required to see before going below minimums. And that is going to be tested on your check ride as well. Your decision altitudes, right? Altitudes where a decision must be made, or decision heights typically come in the form when you have some of those precision approaches, which we'll take a look at here. Right, so precision approaches provide course and glide path information, right? So ILS and your GLS approaches, right, which use those ground-based augmentation systems. Non-precision versus other type of approaches, right? Of course, you have your non-precision, which we just discussed. And then in these approaches, primarily going to have those decision altitudes, where you have to make a decision at said altitude to either go around. So that's the difference between MDAs and decision altitudes, is where one, you can wait until you have visibility of the runway till your missed approach point. And then the decision altitude, as soon as you hit that point, you have to go around if you don't have the visibility of the runway. Of course, you have the decision height, which is depicts it in AGL, and then your MDA, the lowest altitude at which descent is authorized. All right, is that a question? Did they change the name of the ILS approaches to RNV? I think you might be mixing that with RNP approaches, required navigational performance, right? Which is a statement that you'll see on some approach plates that basically state for the set approach, you'll need the required navigational performance, whether that's an RNAV, making sure if you have an RNAV approach with WAS, right, you'll need to make sure that you have a WAS equipped receiver in order to perform set approach. So that's kind of what it's referring to, kind of making sure that you have the required navigational equipment on board for the approach that you need. But none of the approach types have changed names, of course, but great question. All right, continuing through. Next, let's see here, approach charts, right? So we're going to be taking a look at some approach charts here in the last 20 minutes here. We've discussed this in part one, but you'll have your briefing strip on the top, your plan view, your profile, your landing minimums. Then, of course, standard FAA charts come with the top-down view of the airport, or utilizing that as well. Continuing through, approach charts and categories. So it's important to note that different approaches and different approach minimums have different categories, and you'll see it down below here, A, B, C, D. And all of this is based off of your VREF speed, or your approach speed, right? So you have different categories. If you're approaching at under 91 knots, or if your aircraft is capable of flying under 91 knots, you would be in approach category A, 91 to 120, B, so on and so forth, right? Typically for the Cessna 172, a lot of people, I know in the beginning of my training, or when I was a new instrument pilot, I was kind of just flying those category A approaches because, it's a 172. Of course, you're approaching at, at 65, 70 on a nice VFR day. But when you really look at it and playing it safe, especially in IMC, you're going to want to select an RPM setting that's going to keep you anywhere between 90 in that class, category B setting, right? So make sure that you're using the minima for category B when you're looking at those approach places, if you are in that approach category when you're on that final approach fix. You can only go up, you can never go down, right? So make sure you have that aware. For example, A, typically your GA planes. Category B, let's say a King Air, right? Category C, let's say a 737. Category D, let's say a 787, right? The King Air can't go down to category A. Let's say, they removed all of the seats out of the plane and they made it super light where they could approach for some reason. They can't shoot an A approach. However, if you're a Cessna and you're flying a lot faster, you can go up to category B, right? And of course, the category dictates your landing minimums. Choosing the approach and charts, how to choose an appropriate approach and chart. ATIS, right? ATIS will specify the appropriate runway that you're going to be using. Aircraft capabilities, dictating which approaches are an option, right? So depending on the capability or the avionics structure that you have in the aircraft, that also determines the kind of approach that you can do. For example, if you're not equipped with a GPS for some reason, right? You're not able to do those RNAV approaches, right? Or have the adequate equipment to do an ILS approach, so on and so forth. Weather, right? Ceiling, visibility, and approach minimums do play an effect. Straight in versus circling approaches, right? Is a circling required, right? Make sure that you're using those circling minimums. And then, of course, your personal preference. Whatever you are comfortable with, right? Make sure that you're only doing an approach that you're comfortable with, that stand within your personal minimums. Verify the correct and current approach chart, of course. All right. So now what we'll do, again, flying the approach basics, just running through there, right? Maintaining course and altitudes and speeds. Your rate of descent, making sure it's not greater than 1,000 feet per minute. If you do have to descend more than 1,000 feet per minute, that's a go around, right? Make sure you don't miss, right? You're aware of your visual descent point, and you're aware of the glide slope and how many feet per minute that you're needed to do so. Your misapproach, identifying the misapproach point and understanding, committing that to memory. And of course, radio communications, clarify if you're unsure about anything, and request vectors if you need, right? And don't ever feel embarrassed to request additional help. All right, so real quickly, we're going to go over to ForeFlight real quick. I'm going to talk to you guys really briefly Check on my iPad. I don't think I'm going to be able to see you guys once I turn on my screen sharing here. I'm going to go ahead and stop me if you guys cannot see my screen or say something rather. This is ForeFlight, right? So this is a standard view of the instrument, the US IFR low chart that you can get in ForeFlight under your basic subscription. I'm going to quickly plot a flight that I did this past weekend on Sunday, right? I flew from White Plains, right? So I'm going to add that to route. And well, initially I took off from Princeton, but we'll do Trenton since that's close and a lot of people know, right? So typically, whenever I'm building a flight plan in ForeFlight, I'm going to go direct from my start point to my destination, and then I'm able to open up the flight plan view and see that there. From there, we can see the ETE, right? The estimated time en route, distance, a little bit about the route of flight. ForeFlight gives you a great feature here over here in the right corner of routes. It is called the Route Advisor. And it's based off of the historical data of other aircraft that have flown that specific route, right? And you can see that there. And you can see some of the routes that ATC has cleared, right? You can see this first one, SAX Victor 249 SBJ to Yardley. You can see the altitude that this aircraft or it was flown at. 94 nautical miles. It was cleared last Saturday. It was cleared a total of 1,923 times. So then more than likely, we're going to be given this route. But of course, you have other different routes that were given one-off situations that you can take a look at as well. But tell you what, we're going to just select the first one because more than likely we're going to be assigned that route. I mean, you can file any route that you want. You're more than likely not going to get your direct route that you want, right? They're going to mix you up. So it's better to be well prepared and to select a route that you're more than likely going to receive, right? So we have a route laid out there. Then from there, I like to click on the share button, right? We can go ahead and send that to flights, right? You guys know this if you've been avidly flying or if you're a new pilot, right? You have the flights tab that you can file flights even as a VFR pilot. You can put the estimated time of departure there. You have your departure depending on the 1, 2, 3 rules, right? 1 hour before or after, 2,000 feet, 3 statute miles of visibility. If you have that at your point, right, you can file for an alternate, and ForeFlight also does an exceptional job at giving you alternate airports that you can select or use based off of the alternate minimum requirements, right? And going on forward, of course, your aircraft, your performance profile, and then you can go ahead proceed to file, at which you're going to get more detailed information about the aircraft, the true airspeed, making sure that you're referencing your POH to make sure that your true airspeed is accurate, the departure airport, people on board, your en route routes, your or the one that you would like to do, right? Your proposed, your time en route, your fuel on board, so on and so forth. So you're filling out all this information, and then at the bottom, I'm not trying to reveal my ID or my number, but you could see below. You have your name, and then, of course, you're going to put in your phone number, your email, whatever it may be, so that they can contact you. Let's say you forget to close your flight plan, right? And then you click on File. You could go ahead and proceed to file that flight plan. And then air traffic control, they're very, very quick. It's going to come back almost in an instant with the routes that they want you to fly. Of course, you can click on the briefing strip. This briefing tab will give you a legal briefing. So very similar to calling the flight service or 1-800-WX, 1-800-WX brief. This will give you a legal briefing. All you have to do is just click next, and you're able to go through each of the tabs to get a full legal weather briefing that ForeFlight gives you. Remember in the beginning of my flight training journey, I didn't know that ForeFlight recorded it. So I always click on the share button and then just send that to myself. But now I know that ForeFlight does have a database that backs that up. So from there, right, I want to typically when I'm briefing my flight plan, I kind of go from the departure point, right? So the departure, we know that it is Westchester County, click on details. We want to take a look at some of our procedures. I know that they're probably going to be taking runway 32 today due to the METAR and how that's flowing, right? Always looking at our charts. Typically, I like to take a look at the airport diagram to see, and I draw out an expected route from wherever I am on the field to the taxiways that I could expect to get to. Of course, that can always change, so make sure that you're watching your taxiway routes, right? Continuing through, closing that out, back over to maps. Then I want to take a look at my departures, right? Making sure that, again, you're familiarized with any departure procedures that is offered at that airport. So taking a look at some of the FAA charts, all right, I was given the Westchester 7 departure last weekend, right? And you can see I took off of runway 34, and all it is you depart runway 34 on a 343 degree, right? And then once you reach 1,000 feet or higher, so no, not below, you can see the line there shows that you cannot turn below, but once you are above 1,000 feet, you can turn to 295. And I did just that, right? The air traffic controller did not have to talk to me. I just did my route of flight. Whenever you are briefing these departure procedures, make sure that you check your NOTAMs, right? I'm running through each of the NOTAMs of the airport to make sure that you're familiarized. All right, continuing through. So we have our expected taxi routes. We have our departure. We're familiarized with each of the departure procedures. And then, of course, we want to make sure that if there are any minimas for takeoff, we're familiarizing ourselves with each of the runways. For example, runway 29 here requires a minimum climb gradient of 235 per nautical mile. And of course, there's a chart that you can receive to convert a per nautical mile to feet per minute, right? That you can use in the aircraft. But we are taking a look at that as well. So from there, right, we're taking a look at all the charts, familiarizing ourselves with the airport. We familiarized ourselves, of course, with the weather, right, which you're going to do in the briefing, but we familiarized ourselves with the NOTAMs. And then ForeFlight offers a scratch pad, which you can go into. Sorry, that's another scratch pad, but you go into your scratch pad, you click on the plus button at the top or over there, and you can see you have different templates. They give you the craft template. You communicate with the clearance structure. You can talk to them. What I like to do, I like to put in what I can probably expect beforehand, right? I know that I'm trying to get to KTTN, right? So I want to put that in beforehand. If I know the departure frequency, I'll put that in there. If I know typically they give me 2,000, so I'll put 2,000, right? And I'll say 10 minutes, right? 10 minutes after expect my cruise altitude or whatever altitude they have for me. And then I'll put in a little bit of what I can expect from my route, right? Not too much because it's always going to be changed, but some waypoints that you can probably expect to get to, right? So put in all the information before you call them that you can expect, so that you're not fumbling trying to write. That's a little pro tip that I do there as well. All right. From there, we're following our flight plan. We're going en route structure. Let's talk about approaching the airport. So we're at the finishing leg here of the presentation, but approaching our airport, typically I like to follow when I'm briefing the NATS kind of profile. So NOTAMs, the NATS acronym, and that's what Delta Airlines uses, right? So we are first familiarizing ourselves, clicking on details for Trenton Mercer. Right. So now, of course, we want to see what runway we can expect. Right. 350 at 7. Taking a look at the taxiway diagram to see. Forgive my writing on here. Right. You can see some. One moment. Forgive me. Let me bring up the in airport. I want to show you guys the FAA diagram. Forgive me. I have my Jeppesen items all in my ForeFlight, but this, you want to be studying off of the FAA diagrams because that is what they're going to be testing on. But you want to take a look at the taxiway diagram and see which runway you can probably expect for landing. And even though it's a direct crosswind, we could probably expect 24 because I know they've been doing construction on 1634. I know if you take a look at the NOTAMs, right, you could see that one of their runways, 16 and 34, is closed to takeoff except for aircraft less than 12,500 pounds. And the Cessna 172, we qualify for that. However, I've been noticing they still have that big X on the runway. So let's say 24 for practice sake. Right from there, I want to pull up the approach plate that I'm probably to expect. So in this case, I want to do an ILS, right? Let's brief an ILS approach plate, even though, right, the winds are not necessarily favoring that. Let's clear that. So typically, when it comes to my approach plates, again, I want to get my NOTAMs first, taking a look at the NOTAMs and seeing if they apply, right? We want to take a look and say, this is the ILS localizer runway 6, making sure that's exactly what we can expect at Trenton Mercer, making sure it's the right airport, right? Making sure that it is the most up-to-date approach plate that we're going to be using for tonight. And then this is the standard issuance that the FAA has released it under. Trenton, this is the localizer 111.3 for today, our approach course. We want to make sure we have that dialed in, so we have our localizer already on primary or on standby if we're still in the route structure, right? Our approach course, making sure that we have that dialed in into the OBS. Our runway landing distance, it does specify for our aircraft. The Cessna 172 can definitely land at 6,000 feet, making sure being aware of our touchdown zone elevation. The airport 186, or the touchdown zone elevation is 186 feet off the ground, whereas there's a discrepancy in the airport elevation, being mindful. Checking the notes, right? When circling to runway 34 at night, right? What must we do, right? Operational VGSI required. We're not doing a circling approach today, but we can take a look at if we were remaining on or above the VGSI glide path until the threshold. For an inoperative approach lighting system, we must increase our fixed minimums. So we'll be checking the NOTAMs to see. That's why we always check the NOTAMs first to see if we have any approach lighting systems out. From there, typically I'll go straight into my frequencies, making sure our ATIS frequency is in the comms and we have received the ATIS. So NOTAMs, ATIS, right? We're probably with Philadelphia approach, but what I would do, I would put my tower frequency in COM 1 standby, and then of course I want to put my ground frequency in COM 2 standby, because more than likely I'm going to have ATIS in COM 2 primary, right? So just staying ahead of your frequencies in your brief as well. Looking at the top-down view, we can see we have a minimum safe altitude of 2,625 nautical miles from the radius of the Yardley VOR. Taking a look at the approach path, we have some, depending on, how the approach controller may vector us, or we might be, the en route structure may lead to the initial approach fix. So always be aware of your initial approach fix and where that may lead, right? So sometimes you have initial fixes or feeder routes listed on the approach plate, like in this case, right? McGuire. And McGuire also operates as verification for each of your fixes. So you'd have your nav 2 tuned in with the McGuire frequency, where you can verify and also ident. And then from there, you'd shoot your approach from Zubax. We would go to the Copix intersection, the MUNI fix, rather. And then you can see all of your obstacles along in the top-down view as well. It's important to take a look at any notes that are also available. Right, you can see the procedure is not available on the Yardley VOR or on radials 200 clockwise to 277. So if you're coming from any of those radials, this approach or this procedure is not available for you. Of course, it can still be assigned with vectors, but if you're doing this directly from an en route structure, it would not be available to you. Then, of course, the profile view, right? Taking a look at the side, right? We can enter this approach anywhere between 4,600 feet to a lowest altitude of 2,700 feet, going on to the Zubix intersection or fix, going from there, descending down to our first or step down to 1900 for our final approach fix. And you can see it's Copics, and you have the Maltese cross there to depict that that is the final approach fix. From there, descending down to the Imuni point where you stay no lower than 840 down to your minimums. In this case, it's in the ILS, so we have a decision altitude. So we'll be using the straight-in ILS 6. Again, like we stated, we're going to be using category B because we're flying a little bit above 90 from the final approach fix. And you can see we have, if we were to add your touchdown zone elevation to your height, you would get the 414 value there. And then from there, you have your approach briefed with what's initially going to happen along the course. Now we want to take a look at what's happening if we don't make our approach, or we miss the minimum, we miss the runway, or we don't see any of the approach lights. What we do, we take a look at the missed approach, right? So the missed approach, climb to 1500, then climbing left turn to 2700, direct to the Yardley, VOR, DME, and hold. And you can see on the map, it has a visual depiction of that straight to 1500, we're taking left to 2700 to the Yardley, VOR, and holding there. One thing I admit that I forgot here, we want to be always aware of the approach lighting system that we can expect to see, right? So we're going to have a medium intensity approach lighting system with the rail system there, right? And now we can take a look at the top-down view of the airport to see an accurate depiction of that, right? Coming in straight in runway 6 for this approach. On the side, we're going to see a taxiway, right? And this is very, very something that a lot of people don't brief, but you want to make sure that you're aware of what's to the left and the right of your runway so that you don't accidentally land on a taxiway, right? And you know exactly what to expect. We have high intensity runway lights on runway 6 for this approach. And last but not least, at 90 knots, we're expected to be doing 3 minutes and 32 seconds on the clock from the final approach fix. And you can see all the other runways have PAPI lights, but on this runway, we won't have PAPI lights on it there. And that's typically from top to bottom how I would brief an approach plate. I know it was a bit, but I like to get all bits of information in there. And again, I do this on the ground before I take off, right? And then in the air, it's a little bit easier because I know exactly what to expect.
Michael, there's some questions about what you did.
Okay, all right. Yeah, on my screen, I see just my foreflight. Let me stop sharing. All right, let's open this and pop this open. All right. Well, luckily that's the last portion, but we'll go over 2 questions here. Let's go from the top. Let's see. So, Sandra, regarding airspeed deviation while on an IFR flight plan, are you required to report deviations for every leg of the flight plan? Well, it's our as pilots, we want to make sure that we are sticking to what we have filed, right? Doing our best to do so. But yes, because it is mandatory, we want to make sure if it's 5% or plus 10, minus so on and so forth, that we report this so that they're aware of the timing or your estimated time en route or estimated time of arrival, right? Especially if it's going to be consistent throughout your entire route. For different legs, I'm not I would say yes, right? I'm going to get further clarification on that, but because it is a mandatory reporting, you want to make sure that you are reporting it regardless whether it's a leg or whether it's the entirety of the route. So hopefully that answers that. I'll make sure to get further clarification, and I'll list that in the post notes. What distance from the airport should you have finished your approach briefing? Typically, we want to stay 2 steps ahead of the aircraft at all times, especially when you're flying in IMC. So as soon as I get to my cruise altitude, I'm briefing, right? I'm making sure as soon as I finish my cruise checklist, I want to make sure that I'm running through and making sure that I'm 2 steps ahead of the game. Now, when I get about 30 nautical miles or to the field, right, where I have maybe that 10-mile buffer before I'm 20 and I'm starting to prepare for landing, then I review it once more. But as soon as I get onto cruise, right, I want to make sure that I'm prepared for what I'm supposed to do when to get to my destination. But general rule of thumb, 30, 20 nautical miles from the airport, where you can at least receive the ATIS, so you know exactly what runway to expect. Again, what is the plan view? Display multiple lightning bolt symbols. Let's take a look here. What is the plan view? Let me share my screen again. Display multiple lightning bolt symbols. Let's take a look at the approach we were just briefing. Details, procedures, approach, and we were doing the ILS-6. Multiple lightning bolts on the plan view. So these are, let's take a look. Client sub. So we have multiple lightning bolts here for Copics and Zubax and Immuni. Right, so these are I'll have to get clarification on that. I'm not going to answer something that I regretfully, unfortunately, I have forgotten, or I have to research a little bit more of why they have the lightning bolts at each intersection. But I'll make sure that's listed in the notes. I don't want to answer to anything that I'm not entirely 100% sure on. All right, good. And then next, let's take a look here. Would using circling minimums as a personal minimum be a good idea as a new instrument pilot? Now, it's I know from another student, I was getting a question. They were asking of bumping up their numbers, right? Any number that you bump up whenever you're flying in aviation, I think we should always try to fly by the numbers or use the numbers for the approach that we're using, right? I think that makes sure that we are an excellent pilot, right? So I think a lot of people, they try to bump up their approach numbers, right? Because they think that it's going to make them fly safer or be a safer pilot, or they like to bump up minimums numbers, right? So make sure that you have your own personal minimums before even taking off, right? There should be no point where you're in a situation where you feel as if you're in the sky and you have to bump up your minimums just because you don't feel safe. In that case, I would say just divert to your alternate, right? If you see that the ATIS or the weather at your destination is too low to perform the approach safely, I say make sure that you never, if it's too low for your personal minimums, or you feel that the descent or the altitude is too low to your personal skills or your needs, right? Depending on the weather and depending on the ceiling height, I say just make sure to just divert. But if you're approaching the runway and you're not seeing it and you're at the minimums, or you're getting a little bit too low to your personal minimums, it's a best idea to either go around and then divert to a safer airport, right? So always erring to the side of caution, staying by the numbers. Hopefully that answered your question. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing. Good question about reporting speed deviations for each leg. I generally thought deviations were only required to be reported if you were in a non-radar environment. If in a radar contact ATC, the computers know your speed. I may be wrong about that though. All right. So the FARs, I'll get you the specific FAR that speaks to the mandatory reporting points and where it specifically talks about the speed changes, right? Again, it's always incumbent upon us to make sure that if there is going to be a massive change in our speed, for the entire route of flight, that we let them know, because that dramatically changes. Now, yes, you're right. In a radar environment, they're going to have your speed, they're going to have all your information. However, I always still report it, because at the end of the day, if I'm flying a lot faster than expected, it's better to make sure that it's not coinciding with other traffic up ahead or in my route of flight. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, excellent. Now, to continue with the slide, just closing out, instrument flying enables us to fly out of bad weather safely. So, as a old flight instructor of mine used to say, again, it helps us to fly out of bad weather, right? So if you are briefing and you notice that the weather's too low, or it's too low for your personal minimums, or you feel that it's a little bit of a risky bet whether or not you're going to be able to safely fly that day, it's worth just staying on the ground, right? Having that instrument ticket, or that IFR ticket rather, helps you to fly out of bad weather safely, not deliberately fly into bad weather. And that's important to keep in mind. So don't do anything risky or something that you wouldn't do out of pure and proper judgment. All right. Any other additional questions for tonight? I'll be very, very happy to answer. Apologies about that, Sandra. I'm going to make sure that I get that back to you. I don't want to say anything that I'm not exactly entirely or 100% sure on for the FAA approach plates. Yes, it's always a pleasure. All right, guys. If
Mike, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks,
No,
Michael.
of course. Thank you guys very much for listening. Taking time out of your day to listen. I know it's big, especially with time commitments, especially in the afternoons. But I really appreciate you guys, and thank you for listening. Yep.
Mike, real quick, do you is your email posted on Princeton, or do you mind throwing it in the box here?
Sure. I can go ahead throw that in the box there for you guys.
I don't want to take up anyone else's time here, but I'm going to shoot you an email and ask you a couple of things if you don't mind.
Excellent. It's always a pleasure. I'll be happy to answer.
Thanks, buddy. Thanks, Gabriel.
You're welcome. If anyone has any topics that they'd like to cover, let us know. We might be taking off for this summer, depending on feedback. So if you're interested and you think you'd attend, let us know. But if it's summer, and we'll be back, maybe we'll do one more in June and then take off for July and August. But feedback is helpful, so definitely let us know. But thank you,
Thanks again, guys.
Okay, thanks, Mike.
Excellent.
Thanks.
Have a great
Bye.
one.
Have a good one.
Take care. Thanks,
Thank you,
Gabriel.
guys. Brilliant session. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Great job, Michael. Thanks, everyone.